A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, most people think of a real estate bargain as finding a fixer-upper in a decent neighborhood. But in Israel, the ultimate bargain hunter's destination is a city that literally houses a nuclear reactor. We are talking about Dimona. If you look at the numbers from the Central Bureau of Statistics for last year, you can find property there for about 4,500 shekels per square meter. Compare that to 35,000 in Tel Aviv. It is a staggering gap. But as the old saying goes, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is.
It is the definition of a false economy, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, and today's prompt from Daniel really hits on a structural nerve in Israeli society. He is asking about this deep-seated divide between what everyone calls the center and the periphery. Dimona is the perfect, albeit tragic, case study for how a city can be geographically central to the country's defense and energy strategy while remaining economically marooned on a desert island. Think about it. You have some of the most advanced physicists in the world working just a few kilometers away from neighborhoods that haven't seen a new coat of paint since Golda Meir was in office.
It is basically the golden cage problem, right? Or maybe more like a lead line cage in this case. By the way, quick shout out to the tech behind the curtain. Today's episode is actually powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is doing the heavy lifting on the script while we provide the brotherly charm. But back to Dimona. It is only about 36 kilometers from Beersheba. It is not like it is on the moon. So why does it feel like a different planet when you look at a bank statement?
Because geography in Israel is a social and political construct more than a physical one. When we talk about the periphery, we are talking about the development towns, the Ayarat Pituach, that were established in the 50s and 60s. Dimona was founded in 1955. The goal back then was dispersal of the population. But in practice, it meant placing new immigrants, largely Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, in remote areas with limited industrial bases.
And then you fast forward 70 years, and the temporary disadvantage has become a permanent feature of the landscape. It is wild when you look at the infrastructure spending. I was digging into the State Comptroller report from 24. Since the year 2000, per capita infrastructure spending in the Tel Aviv district has been 3.2 times higher than in the Southern district. 3.2 times. You cannot tell me the market is deciding where people want to live when the government is essentially subsidizing the sidewalk in Tel Aviv 3 times more than the road in Dimona.
Well, not exactly in the sense of agreement, but rather that the mechanism is even more skewed than that. That 3.2 ratio actually understates the gap because it does not account for the multiplier effect of being in the center. In Tel Aviv, that infrastructure investment attracts private capital. A new light rail station in Tel Aviv immediately triggers 5 new office towers built by private developers. In Dimona, even when the government tries to throw money at the problem, it often hits a brick wall because the foundational elements are missing. Take the Negev Nuclear Research Center. It has been operational since 1963. You would think having a world-class scientific facility would create a Silicon Valley of the Negev effect, right?
You would think. But instead of a tech hub, you get a giant keep out sign. I mean, I get it, it is a nuclear facility, and Israel maintains this policy of nuclear ambiguity, so it is not like they are going to hold an open house with a gift shop. But the high security restrictions around the site actually deter private investment. You cannot just build a massive data center or a high-tech manufacturing plant next to a site that is, according to most international observers, the heart of the country's strategic deterrent.
It creates a literal and metaphorical dead zone. There are environmental concerns, zoning restrictions, and the simple fact that the 5,000 or so people who work there often do not even live in Dimona. They commute from the center or from wealthier suburbs of Beersheba, so the city provides the land and the risk associated with the reactor, but the economic cream is skimmed off and taken back to the center.
But wait, how does that actually play out on a daily basis? If 5,000 high earners are driving into the city limits every morning, surely some of that money has to leak into the local economy. A sandwich shop, a gas station, something.
You'd be surprised. Most of these high security facilities are self-contained ecosystems. They have their own subsidized cafeterias, their own gyms, sometimes even their own health clinics. The workers drive in through a dedicated gate, stay behind a fence all day, and drive out. They don't stop for coffee in downtown Dimona because downtown Dimona isn't on the way to the highway. It is a classic company town dynamic, except the company is a secretive wing of the Ministry of Defense that does not pay local property taxes in the same way a commercial mall would.
And that trickles down to the kids, Herman. This is the part that actually gets me. The education pipeline in these peripheral towns is just broken. The dropout rate in Dimona high schools is 18%. Nationally, it is 8. But look at the bog route, the matriculation exams. Only 12% of Dimona students hit the requirements for university entry, compared to 35% in central Israel.
That is the opportunity gap Daniel mentioned. If you are a bright kid in Dimona, the system is essentially designed to export you. You study hard, you get into a good unit in the IDF, you move to Tel Aviv for university, and you never look back. It is a massive brain drain. The city is left with an aging population and a workforce that is not equipped for the 21st century economy.
It is a death spiral. You lose the talent, so the tax base shrinks. The tax base shrinks, so the schools get worse. The schools get worse, so more talent leaves. Rinse and repeat for 7 decades. And then we wonder why real estate is 4,000 shekels a meter. It is not a bargain. It is a signal of distress. It is the market saying, there is no future here.
And the government's attempts to fix it have been, frankly, pathetic. Look at the 2015 Periphery Law. The idea was great on paper, give 20% tax breaks to companies that move their operations to the Galilee or the Negev. But if you look at the deployment of those funds over the last 9 years, only 12% of the allocated money was actually used.
12%. That is like offering a discount on a Ferrari to someone who does not have a driver's license.
It is exactly that. A company looks at a 20% tax break and says, great, but do you have high-speed rail so my engineers can get there? No. Do you have a local talent pool of software developers? No. Do you have a reliable supply chain of subcontractors? No. So they stay in Herzliya and pay the full tax rate because the cost of doing business in the periphery is higher than the tax break.
But isn't there a counter-argument there? I mean, look at what happened in the US with places like Austin or even the Research Triangle in North Carolina. Those were periphery once. They built the universities first, and the companies followed. Why can't Ben Gurion University in Beersheba do that for Dimona?
The scale is totally different. Ben Gurion University is a fantastic institution, but it acts more like an island. The student village culture at Beersheba is very insular. Students live there for 3 or 4 years. They party, they study, and then they get their degree and head straight to a job in the Silicon Wadi between Tel Aviv and Haifa. There's no stickiness to the region because the high-tech satellite offices aren't opening up in Dimona or Yeruham. They're opening up in the high-rise towers next to the Hashalam train station in Tel Aviv.
It reminds me of that Intel decision in 23. They were looking at expanding their operations. They chose Kiryat Gat for their new $25 billion chip plant. Now, Kiryat Gat is technically periphery, but it is on the train line. It is a 40-minute commute from the center. Dimona offered even bigger tax incentives. We are talking legendary levels of government. Please come here money. But Intel said no. Because, at the end of the day, a chip plant needs thousands of highly specialized engineers, and those engineers want to live near a theater, a decent bar, and a world-class hospital.
This brings up a point about Startup Nation that we usually ignore in the glossy brochures. The tech boom has been incredibly concentrated. About 80% of all venture capital in Israel goes to companies in the Tel Aviv metro area. 75% of all tech jobs are there. In Dimona, the tech sector employs fewer than 200 people total in a city of nearly 40,000.
That is insane. 200 people represents what? 0.5% of the population. While in Tel Aviv, it feels like every second person is a senior product manager for a cybersecurity startup. It is two different countries. You have the global city of Tel Aviv, which is integrated into the Nasdaq and the London Stock Exchange, and then you have the local city of Dimona, which is stuck in 1974 industrial policy.
And the housing market reflects this distortion in a really weird way. Daniel mentioned the affordability, but there is an artificiality to it. In some neighborhoods in Dimona, empty apartments outnumber families 2 to 1. Investors from the center buy these places because they are cheap, hoping that one day the high-speed rail will arrive and the value will quintuple. But because no one actually wants to live there, the apartments sit empty or are rented out for pennies to people who are stuck in the welfare cycle.
So it is not even a functioning housing market. It is a speculative holding pen for capital from the center. It actually makes the problem worse for the locals, because it drives up the entry-level price without providing any of the economic vitality that usually comes with a housing boom.
There was a fascinating comparison I read recently between Israel and Singapore. Both are small, high-tech nations with limited land, but Singapore has a deliberate regional center strategy. They build these massive hubs like the Jurong Innovation District where they put the infrastructure in first. They build the malls, the schools, and the transit before they even invite the companies. In Israel, we do the opposite. We tell a company, go to Dimona, and maybe in 10 years we will finish the highway.
It is the field of dreams approach, but without the if you build it, they will come part. It is more like, if you come, maybe we will build it. And unsurprisingly, the private sector is not interested in being a pioneer for the government's failed social engineering.
Even when the government tries to be modern, they miss the mark. They launched the Negev Tech Hub initiative in 24, 500 million shekels to jumpstart innovation in the south. It stalled after 6 months. Why? Because they realized that even with the money, there were not enough local people with the Bagrut requirements to fill the training programs. You cannot fix 70 years of educational neglect with a 6-month coding bootcamp for 20-somethings who were failed by their middle school math teachers.
It is a systemic failure of the trickle-down theory. You cannot just drop a nuclear reactor and a few tax breaks into the desert and expect a thriving metropolis to bloom. You need the soft infrastructure, the culture, the education, the social capital.
And let's talk about the second order effects of this divide. When you have such extreme concentration in the center, it creates a massive negative externality for the people who actually live in Tel Aviv. The housing crisis in the center is the flip side of the stagnation in the periphery. Because everyone is forced to cram into this tiny geographic bubble to access the economy, prices in Tel Aviv become decoupled from reality.
Right. If Dimona were actually a viable place for a tech worker to live and work, the pressure on Tel Aviv would ease. But instead, we have a country where you have ghost towns in the south and unaffordable closets in the center. It is a lose-lose situation for the national economy. We are essentially running the entire country's economic engine on 2 cylinders, while the other 4 are rusted shut in the desert.
It is also a massive security risk, if you think about it. Concentrating all your economic value, your intellectual capital, and your administrative power in a single coastal plain makes the country incredibly vulnerable. A decentralized Israel, one where Dimona, Kiryat Shmona, and Eilat are genuine economic engines, would be a much more resilient Israel.
But wait, Herman, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If the government suddenly decided to move, say, the Ministry of Justice or the headquarters of the Israel Electric Corporation to Dimona, wouldn't that force the issue? If you move the jobs, don't the people eventually follow?
We've seen attempts at that. The IDF is currently moving its massive intelligence and technology bases to the Negev, the Likshuda project. It's a multi-billion shekel move. But what's happening? The senior officers and the high-tech soldiers are fighting for shuttles. They don't want to move their families to the south. They want a luxury bus with Wi-Fi that will take them from their apartments in Givatayim to the base in the Negev and back every day. So even when you move the job, the life stays in the center.
That is such a depressing image. Thousands of the country's brightest minds spending 3 hours a day on a bus just to avoid living in the town where they work. It really highlights that this isn't just about money or tax brackets. It's about a total lack of confidence in the peripheral lifestyle.
But that requires a level of long-term planning that doesn't always mesh with the 4-year or sometimes 4-month political cycles we have here. It is much easier to announce a new housing project in Dimona than it is to reform the entire national education funding formula to favor the periphery.
True. And the political reality is that the periphery has often been used as a political football. Voters there are promised development every election cycle, but the actual flow of capital remains stubbornly northward and inward.
And let's be honest about the cultural aspect. In Israel, there's a very real stigma attached to development towns. It's a 1950s term that is carried over into the 21st century. When someone says they are from Dimona, there is an immediate set of assumptions made about their socioeconomic status, their education, even their politics. That stigma is a barrier to entry for young families who might otherwise be tempted by the low housing prices.
So, what is the takeaway for someone listening to this? If you are an investor looking at that 4,500 shekel price tag in Dimona, what should you actually be thinking?
You have to look at the opportunity cost of the dirt. If you buy a cheap apartment in Dimona, but it means you are cut off from the career networking, the high wage growth, and the educational opportunities of the center, that cheap house might actually cost you 500,000 shekels in lost earnings over 5 years. It is a trap for the unwary.
And for the policymakers, the lesson is that incentives are not enough. You cannot bribe a company to move to a place where their employees' kids will get a subpar education. You have to start with the schools. You have to start with the anchor tenant model.
That is an interesting point. Dimona actually has a massive captive market that is currently being ignored. Those 5,000 employees at the nuclear center? They have high salaries, they have stable jobs, and they spend most of their day in Dimona. Yet, if you look at the retail landscape in the city, it is incredibly underserved. There is no high-end grocery store, no premium gym, no professional co-working space that caters to that specific demographic. They literally take their money and drive away with it.
It is like a giant vacuum cleaner sucking the wealth out of the city every day at 5 p.m. If someone could figure out how to keep that capital in the city, even just for dinner and a movie, it would change the local economy overnight. But how do you change that commuter culture? Is it even possible once it's baked in?
It takes a generational shift. You need a mayor who isn't just looking for government handouts, but who is actively courting the creative class. You need to build the third spaces, the cafes, the parks, the galleries, that make a city feel like a home rather than just a place where your mail gets delivered.
The remote work revolution was supposed to be the great equalizer, wasn't it? The idea that you could live in a cheap villa in Dimona and code for a company in Palo Alto or Tel Aviv.
Yeah, I remember the hype in 2021, the end of the office, the rebirth of the periphery. But it turns out that humans are social animals. We like being near other people who do what we do. The agglomeration effect is real. Even if you can work from home 4 days a week, you still want to be within an hour of the office for that 5th day. And until the rail connection to Dimona is actually high speed, meaning 40 minutes to Tel Aviv, not 2 hours with 3 switches, that dream is dead on arrival.
I actually checked the schedule the other day. If you want to get from Dimona to the tech hub in Herzliya by 9:30 a.m., you have to leave your house at 6,015. That's not a commute. That's a pilgrimage. You're spending a quarter of your waking life on a train. No wonder people pay 5 times more to live in a studio apartment in the center.
There is a project on the books for a high-speed link by 2028. If that actually happens, Dimona could become a bedroom community for the center, which is a double-edged sword, right? It would drive up property values, which is good for current homeowners, but it might just turn the city into a dormitory rather than a living, breathing economic center of its own.
I would take dormitory for the middle class over stagnant development town any day of the week. At least then you have a tax base that can fund a decent park or a library. And let's be real, gentrification is a dirty word in some places, but in a town where the average apartment price is basically the cost of a luxury SUV in Tel Aviv, a little bit of upward pressure might be exactly what the doctor ordered.
It is a grim realization that the best case scenario for these towns is often just becoming a suburb of the very center that neglected them for decades. We're essentially saying the only way to save the desert is to make it look more like the coastal plain.
It is the ultimate irony. The only way to save the periphery is to make it part of the center. If you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Or in this case, build a train fast enough that the distinction between here and there disappears.
It really makes you wonder if we can afford to keep going this way. With the housing crisis in Tel Aviv reaching a breaking point, the center is becoming a gated community for the ultra-wealthy and the tech elite. If we don't figure out how to make Dimona, and cities like it, viable places for the middle class to thrive, we are going to end up with a fractured society that eventually snaps. You can't have a startup nation if half the country is still running on 1950s software.
Well, on that cheerful note, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the bargain of southern real estate. It turns out the most expensive thing you can buy is a cheap house in a town with no jobs. It's like buying a discount parachute. You saved money up front, but the long-term outlook is pretty shaky.
A hard lesson, but a necessary one. Big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't wander too far off into the desert ourselves.
And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that make this whole operation possible. We couldn't do it without you.
If you found this dive into the Israeli economic divide interesting, do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show, and we might even answer your prompt next.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will catch you in the next one.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.